I'm an emergency physician here at Anschutz, and I'm a affiliate faculty at the Center for Global Health. And I'm going to talk to you about a book that I just came out with my mentor and co-author, Dr. Auerbach from Stanford. It's called Enviromedics. We made up the word based on we just thought it was a catchy title. So we're going to talk about climate change and human health with a global health sort of flavor to it. On the way here, I was talking to my buddy, and he's like, "What's up?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to go give a lecture." He's like, "You still doing that climate change thing?" I was like, "Yep, still doing it." Yep. And he's like, "Remember, anything you say will be insignificant." I was like, "Thanks for the pep talk. That's awesome." And he's like, "But it's important to try." And I was like, you just slipped Gandhi in there. The famous quote. And I think it just kind of dawned on me because I'm like, this is what climate change kind of feels like in public discourse, certainly on campus. It's that it's overwhelming. None of us feel in a position to do anything, and that there's a sense of hopelessness about it. And particularly the recent political climate, I think, isn't helping positive discourse or constructive discourse, right? And so, but it is very important that we're here, that we're thinking about this, that we're doing it. And I think that that's really the impetus for this book. And we're going to drill down on that a little bit as I talk more about it. So I think that's going to be sort of the theme of what I'm talking about today. I'm going to do some readings from the book, too, because I think that's we just wrote some things that I think illustrate what we're trying to talk about. So bear with me. This is if you kind of get your bookstore vibe on. We'll do that, and I'll make sure I get you out on time. So this is where I work. I'm an emergency physician. I am from upstate New York. I went to college in Virginia and med school and trained in the Northeast, and was at Cornell for 8 years before coming out here on faculty at Cornell's med school, which of course is in New York City. And I got really interested right out of residency in wilderness medicine, which is basically the art and science of taking care of people in remote and austere places. And I really dug it because it was a great educational modality, and that's where I got really into sort of resident and med school education. We were at Cornell, and you can see here, we sort of did the falls in New England, and then the spring. If you've ever been spring in New England, you don't want to be outside too much, so we would come to the Southwest and had this great program there. And a lot of what we talked about was that, environmentalism sort of seeped in. And we had this dual mandate to take care of people in the wilderness, but also the environments themselves. We got to go to some cool places. I got to work with some colleagues at a project in helping establish the Everest Base Camp Medical Clinic, which is just awesome. You're up at Everest and you're taking care of the climbers and the Sherpas at 17,000 feet. So that was really neat. We're going to these incredible ecosystems. And so those were sort of things began to seep in. And this was around the time where climate change started to get politicized and the science started to get a little politicized as well. And there was sort of this inkling in my head that we needed to do more with this program. And then I came out here about 5 years ago, started a program at the School of Medicine in wilderness environmental medicine, a lot of education. And then we were able to do some contract work. So we were able to be EMS medical directors for the Antarctic program and talking to a lot of the support teams there supporting the science. And then we flipped poles, and now we're the medical team to support the NSF researchers in the circumpolar north. And these are the people doing ice cores and things like that. So it just was getting closer and closer. And then I came across an essay from my mentor in JAMA. It was Physicians in the Environment. And it's a great essay. It's a 2-pager. But it really is a very articulate, succinct case to why we should care, why the clinical community should be plugged into the environment. So that's kind of really resonated with me. And then I wrote my own essay. I was inspired and kind of put some thoughts together in the journal for the Wilderness Medicine Society. And it was called Lessons from Dr. Strangelove, and it was great. I see some different generations here. When we talk to the med students, they get kind of antsy, like, Strangelove. Do we have him last semester? Didn't he teach us last semester? I was in his lab. but I know some of you know who this is. Strangelove, of course, was the movie in the 1960s, Stanley Kubrick, which talked about the absurdity of nuclear proliferation. And my point of all this was we have been here before in healthcare, in the healthcare community. We have had existential, big themes that were hard to get our hands around. They were politicized. They were very contentious. And yet physicians from both sides of the Iron Curtain came together in the early 80s, around the time when nuclear wars were becoming winnable. I don't know if you remember that was sort of a deviation from the détente of the 60s and 70s. And healthcare providers from both sides of the Iron Curtain got together and said unambiguously, nuclear war is the final epidemic with no meaningful cure. And because they because they came at it from a purely health point of view, they were unimpeachable from their respective constituencies, and were a very powerful, resonating voice, for the demise of the Cold War. And because of that, they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think this is sort of this analogous place, a historic opportunity that we in healthcare have a chance to do just that, and kind of take the societal discourse from over here to over here. This is really the money slide of what we're talking about. And really harness that metaphorical white coat, whether you're a nurse, doctor, public health, we all wear that white coat. And again, mobilize that power of science communication. I know some people in the room recognize this guy, but does anyone know? Gavi, do you know? You've heard this before, okay.
Sorry. I do have the Dr. Strange.
Okay, good. So you're batting 500. So this is Marcus Welby, MD, and I knew him from reruns, but he was primetime in the 60s. He was a television doctor. He was America's doctor. He was brilliant. He had all the diagnoses right. He had all the time in the world for his patients. Joint Commission never showed up in his office. He never got sued, and he smoked. So he's sort of the emblematic of where healthcare is in our society, and the idea is that we still have that very powerful effect over our friends and family. When someone in healthcare, like I go to the bedside in the emergency department, I'm like, you really should take this medicine, or you kind of need this surgery. And, second opinions notwithstanding, what do people say? Okay, doc. Okay. And we have that. We still hold that public trust in a way that many professions in the cynical society in 2018 doesn't have. So that's a very powerful place that we're talking from. This podium is very powerful for all of us. And the idea is, again, with science communication, is to get us away from altruism. Save the whale. I love whales. I love Mother Earth, but that's a whole different thing. And in abstractions, right? So 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. You're here, so I suspect you probably maybe have a sense of what that is. Most of the public has no idea. Why is that different than 398 or 402, right? But we know it's one of those big thresholds. As carbon dioxide, the parts per million of carbon dioxide creeps up in our atmosphere. Get away from altruism and abstractions and talk about our parents' risk of chronic lung disease or kids' risk of asthma, right? Much, much more different messages to get people to think about their own risk assessment. So we put this together, and this was a textbook that I got to edit with my colleague, George Luber from the CDC. And we said, okay, here's where the curriculum is going to live. And we pulled it in, and it felt really good about it. But we were still lacking. We knew we weren't quite there. And the reason is that people generally still couldn't quite get it. And, when we have these huge snowy winters in the Northeast, that gives the impetus for snowballs on the floor of the Senate. And we know we still have more work to do in sort of explaining what's going on. When we talk about climate change, it's really not a hotter planet, right? It's adding energy to a complex system. So if you have a lump of clay and you shine a heat lamp on it, what do you get? You get a warmer lump of clay, right? But that's not at all what's going on, right? And I think I know you probably all know this, but this is how I sort of break it down, these bullet points I'm just sharing with you. But what we're doing is we're adding energy to one of the most complex systems humans have ever studied, right? The planet, right? It's infinitely complex, practically. And so there's a lot of people who say, we really missed the boat when we sort of framed this global warming. We should have really characterized this as global energizing. But then I had some some science communicators come up to me and like, don't say global energizing. No, it sounds too positive. You have to think of something else. So I don't know what to tell you. But again, certainly more accurate. And then if that still doesn't work, I sort of boil it down, and I was thinking about this, and I was like, here's something that everyone understands. The most complex system that most people come in touch with is a toddler or a little kid. This was my daughter a few years ago. So she's the earth. And I said, let's do an experiment to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. I said, let's put energy into a complex system and see what happens. So we got some concentrated flavored sugar and just dumped it in and see what happens. So at first we saw an energetic child. That makes sense. Very linear and intuitive. Then we saw hyperphysiologic feats of strength, which again sort of supports that linear relationship. But then something started to deviate. We began to see paradoxical hypersomnolence and very erratic behavior well beyond 2 standard deviations from the norm. Right? So this is funny, but the truth is climate change is crazy town, and that's what we're talking about. So that's kind of how I boil it down. And that was really the whole premise of our book, which is to say we have to take the reader to the bedside and really focus in on the health impact. And that's what this book is all about. So what I want to do is just kind of go through and read some passages for you, just short little vignettes to kind of talk to you about what we're talking about. Some of you may roll your eyes at some of these. We wanted to be visceral. We wanted to make it unambiguous, so there's a lot of human suffering. These are composite vignettes from basically our work, a little bit of global health, but really in the emergency department, my co-author and I. And these are all, many of you are probably familiar with these types of patients. The messaging is that these conditions already exist throughout the world, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of them. Okay. Doctor, stat to room 1. You kind of get the theme here. The paramedics have just raced in with an elderly man who had dialed 911 from his home. He sits bolt upright on a gurney, staring death in the face. Drenched in sweat, draped like a telephone pole with wires, with a tightly fitted translucent plastic mask strapped to his face, trapping saliva and aerosolized mist, he's about to become moribund. His fallow body is emaciated, a toll from the years of erosive lung disease. Our doctors have cared for him many times, and he gives us a knowing look through his weary eyes beneath averted lower lids laden with dried-out yellow crusts. His breaths come in wheezes interspersed with loud crackling noises from the depths of his chest. It's a hot summer day, and the air quality index is running deep in the purple. Very unhealthy. How you feeling today, Sid? He's too exhausted to respond. Sid suffers from severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He's a lunger, as in lungs, which he has precious little left, more scar tissue than elastic sponge. Flares of illness like this bring him to death's door quickly without warning. During his ER visits, when he remains lucky and his body recovers enough to keep his pathophysiology from putting him in the intensive care unit, we're able to have him feeling human after a few hours, followed by a couple of days in the hospital for a tune-up. But when he waits too long to call for an ambulance, he winds up with a tube through his trachea attached to a ventilator machine, and he's swept into the labyrinth of intensive care. One of these days, he won't be able to come off the ventilator. This time, we resuscitate him by placing a tube and providing life-saving oxygen, stabilize him by adjusting the breathing machine and giving him drugs and essential fluids, and then we admit him to the ward so he can recover and begin yet another rehabilitation. He's a cat with 18 lives. On the day of his discharge, I see him outside, sitting in a wheelchair, face tilted towards the sun, eyes closed. He's breathing supplemental oxygen through a slim nasal prongs piped through supply tubes that wrap around his head and terminate in his nostrils. Defiant, foolish, and addicted, he's dangerously smoking a Marlboro Red, which is strictly prohibited. He doesn't care. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Looking good, Sid. Thanks, Doc, he says, not the least bit embarrassed to be caught in the act. Tough to quit, but sooner or later I always turn around. Patients such as Sid teach us many lessons, 2 of which stand out. First, although the media tend to focus on individuals and their newsworthy catastrophes, these are dwarfed by issues of population health, which increasingly are dominated by chronic conditions. To the extent that these conditions are generated or worsened by environmental changes, we have an obligation to seek remedies and improve the situation. Second, we need to maximize our survival opportunities, not challenge them relentlessly. Although some diehards certainly are able to postpone the inevitable somewhat, generally they only do so through medical interventions requiring copious resources. What are our current environmental conditions? Where are they headed? We shouldn't take a fatalistic approach and assume that patients such as Sid are, quote, just a matter of time. It would be easy to simply attribute the fault to him and cast him aside because tobacco contributes to the disease. But why did Sid get sick on a hot day when the air was full of particulate matter? Whom do we blame on the days when children with asthma or cystic fibrosis who have tenuous lungs are forced to breathe the equivalent of cigarette smoke just because they inhale bad air from the atmosphere around them? It is not their fault. We have no one to blame but ourselves. At the heart of medicine are principles of prevention that patients stricken ill rarely can achieve outcomes better than if they had never become sick in the first place. Despite all the amazing cures and interventions we have at our disposal, we can't exercise away a lifetime of fast food and too many cocktails. Obesity leads to diabetes, alcohol leads to liver disease, mosquito bites lead to Zika virus infection. Everyone understands cause and effect. So, we're going to use a straightforward approach to address a topic that is at the top of everyone's list for what will determine our future on this planet, namely the environment. Specifically, we will frame current environmental issues in the context of their implications for human health as we understand them. So that kind of gets us started. We can sort of see the visceral feel we're trying to get. If you've never seen this slide, to me this is really an outstanding summary slide. It's almost a cheat sheet, if you will, if you want to just kind of explain to anyone what's going on or to understand yourself. At the core, of course, are the drivers: rising temperatures, extreme weather, increasing carbon dioxide levels, and rising sea levels. And then from that, you can see the impacts on the environment. And then the third ring, of course, is the health impacts. So again, this is a CDC slide. It's in the book, but it's readily searchable. And again, it's I find it one of the most helpful just to sort of orient a person who has never seen this or hasn't thought about this too much before. Just want to kind of go through a few more vignettes, and you'll see a theme emerging, and it's a theme of vulnerability. That's what climate change is. That's why, again, I sort of got interested in it through wilderness medicine, but it's kind of coming back now towards emergency medicine when we think about vulnerable populations and disaster response. But that's one of the key take-homes, is that this is a disease of vulnerability, and it's the most vulnerable, whether through geography, pathophysiology, socioeconomic. We're going to be pummeled from this. Too hot. Philadelphia can be intolerably hot and humid in the summer. Muggy means more like getting mugged by the heat. Walk down Broad Street near Temple University and watch the shimmering waves of hot air rise from the pavement. Step over the bubbles of sticky asphalt, or the bottom of your shoes will turn black and nasty. Daisy's apartment was right across the street from the hospital, but she was too old and proud to leave her cramped, stifling quarters to make her way to sit in the air-conditioned lobby. Last Thanksgiving, when it seemed that Daisy would be alone for the holidays, the landlord had deposited her in the waiting room of an ER, knowing that the doctors would admit her to the hospital, assuring that she would be fed and cared for over the holidays. But now Daisy was resolute, and she wasn't going nowhere. From now on, she was determined to be on her own come hell or high water. Old folks can be stubborn, and Daisy was no exception. Daisy didn't remember the summers of her youth as being so hot for so long. In the old days, she could go to the beach, play in the sprinklers, and drink lemonade in the shade. When you're 93 and living alone, you just sit and swelter. You can't do anything quickly. Her kids could have been thousands of miles away for all they paid attention to her, and the landlady was irresponsible, so the fans and air conditioning seldom worked. After the temperature records were broken for 10 straight days, 90 plus turned to 100 and it became really dangerous. The electrical grid was overwhelmed, and the first brownout turned off 100,000 cooling units. Daisy's was one of the first to fail. She simmered, yet paradoxically her thirst disappeared. It was nauseating to drink tepid tap water, so she stopped taking her heart medication and her ankles began to swell. The demands on her body were too great. As Daisy's body tried to cool, her heart rate increased and the tired pump muscle began to fail. We take a lot for granted when we're young, including being able to survive a heat wave. That doesn't apply to older people. She didn't stand a chance. Davy suffered like the others in the stifling heat, and her old heart and nervous system couldn't handle the enormous stress to her system. Too tired to leave, she sat on the couch and sweated until she had no more sweat to give, and became more dehydrated and tired while her organs began to fail. After her kidneys shut down, she slipped into unconsciousness. Even if she had awakened, she wouldn't have remembered because a stroke from a leaky artery in her brain wiped out her memory. Could all this have been avoided? Well, Daisy wasn't going to get any younger, but she didn't need to die when she did. In the city of brotherly love, the heat wave claimed 50 victims in a week, most of them senior citizens who simply didn't have the knowledge, resources, or ability to cool themselves before their bodies called it quits. Across the nation in the same week, hundreds more succumbed to the heat. With a warmer planet, this would undoubtedly begin to happen every summer to increasing numbers of victims. We're going to stick with the heat theme and talk about some worker health issues, some vignettes. And the first one is this next one is from a paper that came out a couple years ago that was made had a lot of attention in the press, and it was that researchers had determined that by the year 2050, even being outside in certain parts of the Middle East, particularly the humid parts, like around the Persian Gulf, it would be incompatible with life, meaning it wasn't a matter of if you got sick, it was how long could you stand outside before you'd succumb, because your body would have no meaningful way to cool itself off. Sonny was thrilled to have landed a construction job in Qatar. His salary would go a long way to pulling his family out of squalid living conditions back in the slums of Lahore, Pakistan. He considered himself lucky. Heat and humidity were a constant in the Persian Gulf. The legendary heat had always made it an excruciating place to work, but over the past few decades, the weather had come to resemble one of Dante's circles of hell. And by the way, this was the Middle East in 2050, so we're in the future. Sonny was intimately familiar with the local risks. One of his uncles had perished in the push to compete the World Cup stadiums in 2022. The official meteorologic cause was a heat wave. Extreme weather events were now the norm. The upcoming week's forecast for Doha was predicted to exceed a heat index of 165 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wet globe bulb reading of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Still, Sonny was undeterred. The construction project was behind schedule, and the bosses were offering double salary to work through the hottest noon hours. No problem, he confidently mused as he carried a gallon of water to the site for an 8 a.m. start. The wet globe bulb measures both temperature and humidity using a thermometer wrapped in a moistened cloth. It's how the heat index is determined. This measure of ambient heat stress upon the human body is considered to be more predictive of heat illness than environmental temperature alone. On this day, the heat index would outpace Sonny's ability to cool himself, regardless of hydration and occasional break from exercise. Sweat cools the body by evaporating into the surrounding air, taking body heat with it. In the stifling conditions of a Middle East extreme heat event, the air is so full of moisture that sweat evaporation cannot occur, leaving the body to slowly steam and roast. 20 minutes into the workday, Sonny was drenched with sweat. He drank continuously and tried to seek the shade, thinking this would help him beat the heat. His body temperature rose. By 11 a.m., he had a throbbing headache and felt weak and sick to his stomach. By noon, he had guzzled so much water that he had diluted the sodium concentration in his body to a dangerously low level. By 1 p.m., he was repetitively vomiting and so confused that he believed he was talking to his grandmother in Pakistan. He collapsed and was rushed to Ahmad Hospital, where the astute doctors immediately immersed him in an ice water bath. His core body temperature was 108 degrees, hot enough to kill him. But he was lucky because the doctors cooled him in the nick of time. After a rocky week in the intensive care unit, he eventually made a full recovery. Such was the risk for laborers in the Middle East. The next one is the vignette. Reflects some of the work that we've done here. Lee Newman and the work that his group has done, as well as Rick Johnson in nephrology, have done a lot of work looking at worker health in Central America, particularly related to kidney disease. And they have are now coming up with some really good data that correlates extreme heat event with renal failure and chronic renal disease in young workers. It's thought to be multifactorial, has a lot to do with access to clean water, but definitely correlates with heat and sort of highlights the vulnerability that people who can't decide whether they're outside or not, i.e. Agricultural workers, the vulnerability that they face. Life had never been easy for a farmer in El Salvador, but compared to the murderous years of civil war, hard labor and the heat seemed like an improvement. Mauricio was grateful to raise his family in the time of peace. Sugarcane was in high demand and the work was steady and reliable. After 20 years in the field, he thought he knew how to keep himself safe. It was punishing labor, and over the years, the tests of endurance had ratcheted upward. Daytime temperatures grew hotter, the drinking water more scarce, either dried up or diverted for agriculture. Like most of his colleagues, Mauricio was suspicious of the local water source in the cane fields because it was brackish and certain to give a man diarrhea. It was his daily custom to hydrate with a liter of Fanta and boiled coffee. At 36 years old, the formerly rugged farmer had a reputation for being one of the strongest workers, but over the past few months his body was changing. He was losing his stamina. By midday he was winded and couldn't keep up. His legs were visibly swollen. Waves of nausea were a daily routine, and he suffered from mal d'orine, a peeing painful sand-like material, sometimes with the appearance of rust. Sunday was his day of rest, and today he spent all of it in bed, disappointing his 5 children who implored him to play. Before the new week began, he told his wife that it was time to make the 6-hour trip to Hospital Rosales in San Salvador. Within minutes of hearing Mauricio's story, the doctor sighed. He had heard it many times before, and he was fearful. Later that afternoon, when the blood test confirmed his suspicion, he broke the sad news to his patient. Mauricio's kidneys were shutting down, and he became another of the many young victims of Mesoamerican nephropathy, an emerging epidemic of kidney failure caused by prolonged exposure to extreme heat and lack of consistent access to potable water. There was no cure. If he had the financial resources, Mauricio could spend 3 mornings per week connected to a dialysis machine, but that was an impossible proposition for a sugarcane worker who lived hours away from a medical center. And for a poor man, a kidney transplant was all but impossible in this part of the world. So we talked a lot about heat, and interspersed between these vignettes is a layperson's overview of the science. I just want to conclude our vignettes with one on water security. By Monday, the global weather radar showed a tranquil atmosphere. On Tuesday, early signs predicted a developing system. By Wednesday, it was obvious that meteorological chaos would be in force within days. The typhoons and hurricanes could be predicted, but not the simultaneous earthquakes, floods, and mudslides. Whether by coincidence or as a feature of a changing climate, the natural events overwhelmed the capacity of governments, the world's health organizations, and non-governmental relief groups to manage the catastrophes and predictable infectious disease sequelae. Ian was on the ground in the Dominican Republic treating broken bones and crushed limbs after the massive earthquake centered underneath Santo Domingo. The news media reported the gale force winds and waves that pounded the Philippines, and yet another tidal wave had struck Indonesia. Naval fleets and hospital ships that would have provided life-saving services in normal times had been deployed to conflict zones to support military missions in the Middle East and North Korea, so they were not available to assist the millions of people imperiled by the onslaught of natural disasters. Countries fighting each other had few resources to call upon in a time of increasing global, non-conflict weather mayhem. When the good doctor treated the first victim who had all the classic symptoms of the dreaded epidemic diarrheal disease, he knew that he was about to fight a losing battle with what would likely become a pandemic. Like many other survivors in the earthquake zone, Maria lived in a tented camp and suffered diarrhea. However, what was different was not subtle. Within 1 day of her initial abdominal pain, cramping and vomiting, she suffered the explosive appearance of voluminous rice water diarrhea, more than 1 liter an hour, that rapidly caused profound dehydration, weakness, and low blood pressure, leading to true physiological shock. The culprit was cholera, an often lethal diarrheal disease in adults and children caused by the toxin created by the Vibrio cholera, which colonizes and multiplies within the gastrointestinal tract of the victim. It is spread by contaminated water and food supplies in areas of poor sanitation. These conditions are a feature of natural disasters such as earthquakes and floods, and also where people are crowded in refugee situations. Given the overcrowding of the refugee camp and lack of medical personnel and resources, Maria suffered for 2 days before she was prioritized for transport to a location where she might receive aggressive hydration. She died en route and became one of the 50% of untreated victims who dies. So you can see these are dramatic vignettes. A lot of again highlighting just the very vulnerable situations of people around the world, of which climate change is going to be the force multiplier. We talk a lot about adaptability in these situations. How do we, what capacity do we have to adapt to these changes, and how do we enhance mitigation and adaptability through public health efforts and so forth. Here's just a good slide that reminds us that if you can, again, looking at ecosystems, if you can sprint, run, or fly, you have a chance to, again, looking at different species, you have a chance to sort of adapt into a new ecosystem as the temperatures rise compared to historical averages. And you can see here they have RCP 2.6 is sort of less of a change, 8.5 is the extreme change, and these are conventions used by climate scientists. They're called representative concentration pathways, and it really represents the bell curve of, less change, 4 or 5 is in the middle, and 8 is the extreme change. But when we think about humans, you get lots of different answers, particularly depending whether you're in the U.S. or otherwise. But just think about, America the last year, right? We had within the last 12 months, Puerto Rico, Houston, California, and these are pretty dramatic events that disrupted a lot of people's lives and well-being. And then, here are pictures from, I guess now 13 years ago, from Katrina, which was an extreme weather event causing an urban flood. And, it was very dramatic. But then you can say, well, okay, this was horrible and certainly unprepared. But then these people got resources that they needed. FEMA eventually stepped in, and they were taken care of. And that's parts of that story are true. But when you look about those people, where are they today? And you see this, and you see what we know as a forced migration, right? It was these people were internally displaced and needed to go find new livelihoods away from their family, their friends, the places where they grew up, their healthcare system, et cetera. And that sort of brings up this idea of climate justice, which gets us to the end of our book. Very simply, it's those who are affected by the negative impacts are the least responsible for the causes of the problem. I actually like talking about this. I've done some work in this field because it gives us a vocabulary of enforcement using existing international compacts and existing norms and global governance that say, hey, if we can frame part of this as a human rights issue, now we have the ability to sort of hold agencies and governments accountable, which is really interesting. So I just wanted to read a passage from a woman that we had a chance to do work with in the past, Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the former President of Ireland, and gave a great, very brief overview of what climate justice is. Climate justice highlights this is Mary Robinson, highlights the impacts of climate change on the vulnerable, marginalized, and poor, who are disproportionately affected by extreme weather events such as floods, storms, and droughts, and slow onset events such as sea level rise and glacial melt. Climate change is already undermining many of their basic human rights to food and water, to shelter and health. Climate justice points out that that undermining these essential rights is an injustice, largely because those who are affected by the negative impacts are least responsible for the causes of the problem. We continue. Perhaps the greatest health rights vulnerability from climate change is the injustice perpetrated within a span of time that doesn't reach its full effect until considerably later. This notion calls attention to the fact that our actions or omissions today will affect future generations more profoundly than they will our generation. It is very possible that our failure to halt human-caused climate change will not show itself until the next generation or future generations. University of California, Berkeley professor Kirk Smith points out that the damage to others, including from climate change, can be propagated across time by our own present actions, and even some actions that seem rational or apparently harmless in the short term. The moral implication of this is intergenerational equity, and holds our contemporaries and us liable for human rights violations against future generations. Perhaps, like never before, they may suffer for our failures. And here's a quote from Kirk. The rich will find their world to be more expensive, inconvenient, uncomfortable, disrupted, and colorless in general, more unpleasant and unpredictable, perhaps greatly so. The poor will die. So this is where we got to the end of our book, and we were like, man, this is such a downer. Like, we've got to be able to turn this around. And I think, it was a creative process. We were focused on getting the information out, but we really fell into that trap of like, this is informative, but what's the narrative? Why should anyone read this? And how do we make this a net positive experience? And we sort of thought about it for a while, and we were like, we went back and forth on different ideas, and then we realized, we had the foreword. We were able to get Harvey Feinberg, who's the former president of the Institute of Medicine, to write the foreword. So he's kind of like on the medical all-star team, big, very well thought out guy and a good friend. So we're like, well, why don't we have an afterword, and let's let the kids write it, because it's our generation, the adults that aren't getting it done, and there's so much energy in the youth sector, and let's really highlight that and let them finish it. So we did. We put together an afterword, and we got some really dynamic individuals to give us some essays, and we put it together in the afterword. We have Carolyn Spears, who's the co-director of Students for Sustainable Stanford on the upper left. Charles Orgbon III, down here, started a nonprofit, Greening Forward, when he was 12. Brianna Fruan, a Pacific Islander from Samoa, started her own nonprofit there, 350.Samoa. Shudas Cap Martinez in the upper right. He's local. He's in Boulder. He's a young rock star, literally. He's a music performer and is an environmental activist for the group Earth Guardians. And then you may recognize Jaden Smith in the middle, and he's the son of the actor Will Smith and Jada Pinkett. And he is a co-founder of a water company that just uses paper bottles called Just Impact, which invests in clean energy solutions. So we sort of turned it over to them and said, guys, will you help us out and give us an upbeat ending? So I'm just going to read a couple things from them. And this is from Jaden. I'm writing this because the problems stated in this book will have to be solved by our generation. Yes, our generation. Perhaps the last one that can have a serious impact before we do damage to our planet that cannot be reversed. The details about climate change and its effect on our health have not been on the forefront of the minds of the millennials, but they should be. This issue could accelerate and become more catastrophic and less reversible each year if we don't become involved. It will be our generation and beyond that is forced to redesign our lives in Miami, Venice, Tokyo, Boston, New York, Bangkok, Manila, Shanghai, and countless of other cities worldwide. Not only might we have to redesign these places at a massive economic cost, but we'll have to do this while facing unprecedented physical and mental stressors associated with human displacement and migration, with many of us assuming the burden of what unfortunately will become a common label, climate refugees. This is my call to action for everyone of my generation. Now is the time to discuss the effects that climate change has on human health. Now is the time to get a head start on what might otherwise become an unavoidable future. Learn as much as you can. Work hard in school and appreciate all sides of every issue. Go into science and engineering to help steer your mind and energies into clean technology, conservation, environmental studies, and law. Join and support policy advocates like the National Resources Defense Council. Contact your local political representatives and speak your mind about their role in supporting climate mitigation laws to protect our air and water and our future. Go into medicine with an understanding that healthcare professionals will be in the thick of the fray. Be bold. Start conversations. Speak up. Vote. Build a sustainable life for yourself and the people around you. And I'll conclude with Carolyn Spears. We take a lot for granted that drinkable water will come from the faucet or that affordable food will be available at the grocery store. In the past, I've also assumed that our elected leaders will care about facts and that our government will attempt to improve people's lives, and that the infrastructure investments we've made will not go to waste because of climbing temperatures or rising seas. Coming of age in today's society has required some heart-wrenching realizations, and I no longer take for granted many things. I have lost faith in the idea that truth will trump political ideologies and in the ability of some people to stay true to their own values in the face of uncertainty and stress. I no longer believe that the arc of the moral universe, however long, will automatically bend towards justice. With these realizations, I can either give up or be inspired. I choose the latter. The arc of the moral universe will bend towards justice because we will be there bending it. The will to distinguish facts from fiction will return to our political institutions only by the insistence of a people reconnected with democracy. I will stay engaged, and others will with me, because we refuse to accept that our society is irreparably separated from scientific truths, and that, as Dr. Lemery and Auerbach have shown us, have enormous consequences for our health and welfare. As a young person, I am worried, but I am also motivated by we the people, a phrase that, I hope, includes you. So, you can see we, just to summarize, what was the, why this? It was written for lay people, and it was really designed to, give that palpable sense of suffering in what this is really about. And again, we use that medical bedside emergency medicine lens to essentially change collective risk assessment for our everyone we touch. People often say to me, I think they interpret what I'm saying. Sometimes when they say, well, do you think we need to go talk to our patients about this? And I say, well, maybe, but it is a little absurd in a busy emergency department. That's where I work again. It's just, to sew up someone's laceration, say stitches out, 5 to 10 days, look out for infection. By the way, let's talk about climate change, right? That doesn't quite work, and that's not the point. The point isn't necessarily to forcefully interject it in that interaction, but we have a lot of influence, us in healthcare, over our friends, our families, and that's really where I think we need to be more vocal, just as we would, talking about the effects of smoking or bike helmets, things like that. The goal of all this is to interject knowledge so we can all help change our collective risk assessment, so we have a better sense of energy choices and what the real risks are, the importance of clean air, understanding what it means to have the loss of biodiversity, the importance of clean water, and the devastating effects of extreme weather events. Because the truth is, life on Earth is going to be thriving no matter in any of these scenarios, right? Here, the parts per million of carbon dioxide was over 800 back in the dinosaur age, and life was teeming everywhere, right? But that's not what we're talking about, right? It's the people, it's the Homo sapiens that we're worried about. So I just want to conclude by bringing us to those caves in southern France, where we have this amazing paintings 30,000 years ago of animals. Some are now extinct, but cave bears and lions and tigers and horses. And we'll finish there. Among the breathtaking drawings of horses, cattle, mammoths, lion, and bears, we see a single handprint. Our ancestors spoke to us. We are here. and we're going to do great things. How will history remember us? Will we be the cursed generation of the era of the great procrastination? Or will we educate each other, change our behaviors, and protect our progeny with a like-minded purpose? We hope it's the latter. If we succeed, perhaps our descendants will view us millennia hence with gratitude and respect because we embodied the best attributes of the human spirit and left them a legacy of creativity, peace, prosperity, and the best possible place to live. So I'll stop there. Stick around for questions. Thanks for spending lunch with me. We'll start with Gabby for questions. I'm just messing with you. Molly.
So your book was written for a lay audience, and I'm curious what sort of reception you've gotten from them and the kinds of questions they have.
Yeah, thanks. Reception has been good, really. I mean, it's tough to get something like this out there, and we're with a publisher who's got a great reputation, but just not much marketing power. So a lot of it has been just us tweeting and showing up and trying to get friends in media to put us on the radio or whatever. But the response has been good. I mean, I will say I haven't gotten much pushback. I think it's different levels of shrugging. Pushback meaning we don't believe what you're saying, but more like, some people really dig it. Others are not. I'm not going to pretend that there's no political agenda here in the sense that we want change. So I guess that's it. But the real goal of us, what we're trying to do, is to bring it forth from a healthcare point of view. So I feel very comfortable talking about that here, about healthcare. What I try not to do is pretend that I'm a policy guy. So when people say, well, what about, China and what we're doing, the cap and trade system and things like that, I try not to, I give my opinion, I think it's a good idea, but I try not to be an expert at that too, because then I think you lose your relative advantage, relative expertise. So I think, but when it comes to the pure health stuff, I think it's amazing still, even amongst, healthcare providers are like, I had no idea. It's amazing. So it's still a lot of work to be done, surprisingly. We just got back from a conference in D.C. called the Medical Society Consortium for Climate and Health. And it's all the major medical societies are there, a lot of them. So it's ACP, Family Medicine, Pediatrics, ACOG is there. And on paper, they were making a big point of this. On paper, they represent over half the physicians in America. We know that's just a skewed statistic because it's not half of the physicians in America are fully embracing these ideas. But the fact that the medical societies are there is a big deal. Interestingly, emergency medicine isn't, which is difficult from where I sit. It's hard to get them to pay attention to this.
Why do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So I think the leadership has viewed this more in that what's now unfortunately a tradition of this is a political issue. We're not ready to get into it. And also I think it's just bandwidth. I've talked to some of the leaders and they're like, yeah, we never thought about that. And they've, rather than having a top-down approach, like we need to have a policy statement about this, they said, well, why don't you, work the channels through our public health section and, kind of pushing you off to the respective subcommittees. Truthfully, the success of these other groups has been from the tippy top where the standing president or executive committee has said, this is really important. We need to assign the right people to represent and report back. And ACP came out with a big position statement a couple of years ago in Annals of Internal Medicine. Very cited, very comprehensive, and that was a big deal. That's obviously, I think, if not the biggest, one of the top medical colleges in the country. So, cool. Well, please email me with anything that may pop up or around. And thanks. It's good to see some familiar faces here too. Thanks for calling.